We've been talking about water a lot this week, and so this will continue the theme and we'll get into the nuts and bolts a little bit. One of our goals here is to empower land trust practitioners to do water rights due diligence. We have great attorneys in the room, we have water professionals, we have baseline preparers, all of whom help with this. But oftentimes with conservation projects, we've got a lot of work before that time. There's no funding, and we need to both be able to scope and vet water rights in conservation easements early on. We need to do robust due diligence. And so we've sort of framed this for easement holders considerations, starting with organizational considerations. Why are we doing this anyway? Into some nuts and bolts, and then we will get into a little demonstration of some of the public databases that we use, and proceed from there. So we want this to be conversational. Please feel free to interrupt or raise a hand and ask a question as we go. I'm Ben Lenth. This is Carmen Farmer and Karen Foley. We're all with Colorado Open Lands. Carmen and I are both senior project managers, so we're on the new easement acquisition side of things. And then Karen is our land and water steward in Westcliff, so she's on the stewardship side and has a lot more practical experience than Carmen and I do on this. But so there's a lot to think about, and so we'll get started. Okay. So this is what we're going through. I mentioned that. Why water rights due diligence? What are the questions we're asking? We'll start with this. And starting big, we work for land trusts, or we're supporting land trusts and municipal open spaces, and so we wouldn't be talking about this if we didn't have some organizational goals to protect water in some form connected to land. But there's more to that. There's organizational considerations that we'll get into. We want to know what the actual ecology is. What is the water like on the land? How is it used? What are the different types of water rights? All these things that we'll go through to consider. And part of this then being coming to a decision point: do we encumber the water or not? Or did we encumber it before? I used to work for the San Isabel Land Protection Trust, and we had an evaluation done of our water rights portfolio about a decade ago, and the conclusion was, by a water rights attorney, that they don't know if we encumbered it or not. It was ambiguous in some cases, other cases it was clear. Other times there was no water even with the property. And so there's a lot to consider, and within the framework of easements, these are all sort of probabilities over time. We're making promises, but there's factors beyond our control that sometimes come up, and we need to understand those over time. So starting with the organizations, every project's different, every group is different, we have different goals. Some of us have goals to protect rivers specifically, others agriculture, others all the above, or neither. And so for any organization that doesn't have sort of a philosophy behind this or certain goals, it's important to have that from the board level down. And so what are we trying to protect? What are the threats? And this is all part of our project selection criteria. Why are we doing what we're doing? If there wasn't a threat, we wouldn't be motivated to try to do this most of the time, but we also act opportunistically and protect land and water when it's available. There's nothing wrong with that either. And then, importantly, what other demands exist for this water? And are there opportunities to have multiple benefits out of a project? And Carmen is more versed in that, and we'll talk more about that. But doing conservation easements with some flexibility to share water when needed. And then risk tolerance, as we're talking about. We can't guarantee things per se, although we purport to, and we need to acknowledge that and be comfortable with that. Whoops. So starting with the natural systems. Where's the water? What does it look like? Where does it come from? I think we like to look at this at multiple scales. Yes, an easement is within those boundaries, but the water's coming from somewhere else. And it might be on a ditch where the delivery depends on a whole lot of other people, or within a watershed that has other things going on that can influence the ability to irrigate or do other things with your water. And all within a basin that has different rules for how water is administered across the state. All of these present challenges. And one of the main questions here, what does the water look like? What's it specifically used for? Can it be transferred and severed from the land? That's our basic assumption in Colorado, is that water can be severed and sent elsewhere. But it might not be physically possible. And in which case, do we need to worry so much if it's never going to go anywhere? These are all just questions to ask. Mostly this is a lot of questions that we'll be sharing. So as a review, you guys know this, there's different types of water rights. And this varies a lot geographically. Where Carmen works, a lot of mutual ditch companies. In the southern mountains, there are no ditch companies. It's all direct flow, individual ditches, or groups of landowners who might have agreements, formal or informal, on how to share water, what their timing is, and so forth. And then there's decreed uses. We're mostly looking at stock water and irrigation water, but maybe it has decrees for other things. Maybe it's already able to be used for municipal uses, and that landowner has opportunities that might not exist elsewhere without barriers.
Or decreed for storage, which is very important, particularly when you're looking at a property and you're trying to be strategic in a changing climate, understanding, do they have early season water and late season water? Because that farm might be more resilient as growing seasons change and temperatures change and drought and all those things that we encounter. And so that goes into that calculus when we're looking at a property and trying to understand, okay, in 50 years, are they going to be able to deliver that water? Is that a senior water right? I mean, we'll get into all of those different things, but it starts with the type of water rights and identifying when you're sitting down with a landowner and understanding what's their understanding of it. Some folks are very sophisticated with their water rights, particularly where I am in the South Platte Basin, where every drop is counted, and they've got center pivots and sprinkler irrigation and everything like that. And then other places it's sort of like, well, when it's in this like high mountain stream, we divert, sometimes we don't. And so getting their understanding, and then we'll get into some of the due diligence where we actually do some, essentially fact checking or investigation with your, local water commissioner and other resources. And Ben's going to walk us through some of that. But you got to have an understanding of that fundamental water right and how different they are. The surface flow stuff versus the mutual ditch companies versus the wells. When you go into the San Luis Valley or the Republican River Basin out east, you're in a whole different landscape in terms of how those water rights are administered and understanding some of the risk associated with them turning off wells in the future, and what that could look like to satisfy compact requirements. And so these are all questions you've kind of got to ask. And you get dangerous or know enough to be dangerous with it, and then that's where you start to say, okay, do we need to go talk to an attorney or have the landowner talk to their water rights attorney? And we'll elaborate a little bit more on that. But
for sure. And fundamental here is that conservation easement is a legal tool that can only protect property rights that you actually own. And so the presence of water on a property doesn't mean there's a water right associated with it. And that's one of the key questions is, what is the nature of that right? It can only be encumbered if it's clearly owned and decreed for certain use. So use on the property is key question. This is where baselines come in very handy, but referring to the landowner and using the landowner as the primary source of information, especially if they're a long-term owner and irrigator. But how do they use it? What types of irrigation? For how long? When do they get their water? When don't they get their water? How does it actually flow on the property? They have ponds, they have ditches. And what does the landowner need? If they're talking to us about land conservation, they have certain goals. And regarding water, those goals might be a complete encumbrance and tying every drop to the land, and that has been our standard through time. But looking for flexibility has been the more modern approach. And Colorado Open Lands has been using water sharing language for some while. Our colleague Sarah Parmar wrote a guide on, it's called Sharing Water to Save the Farm, talking about how you can marry these concepts of land protection, tying the majority of water to the land, but allowing some opportunities that are both financially beneficial to landowners, but also to the public. If we're in a water scarce state, there's just not enough water for all these uses as they're practiced. And so we know, agriculture gets beat up on this all the time. The majority of water is in agriculture, and that's where people are looking. But if we can find those win-wins where there's not complete dry up, it remains productive while protecting the land. That's our goal.
If I could just add to that really quickly, in terms of that flexibility, some of you went out to Bill Fels's place the other day, and we looked at an example of where they left water in the river. And so you're doing an analysis where you're thinking about the conservation values. If he doesn't irrigate for that particular period of time, is that going to have a negative impact on the conservation values that you've identified on that property? And so when we're sitting down with a landowner at that initial stage and we're talking about, okay, this is what you do productivity-wise on your property, is your priority to make that farm or that ranch the most productive it can be in the future? Is it an ecological outcome? Is it all of the above? Is it the scenic vistas? So thinking about, if we leave some of that water out, or if we give them that flexibility to share some of that water, and sharing it might be using it on another farm that they have. It might be, in my case, a lot of times it's sharing it with a municipality who's looking to acquire some leasable water without drying up farmland. And so we have to look at that and say, all right, is this farm, are they fully irrigated? Do they have 3 acre-feet per acre if they're trying to grow corn? Or is it something where they can get by with 1 acre-foot per acre? And so that all goes into it, and it has to do with your objective when you're trying to protect that property. Is it because you're trying to protect the viability of that agricultural operation? Or is it more sort of like, this is a community separator? This is really important habitat for Preble's meadow jumping mouse or something else. Or is it, the scenic vista, and you want to make sure that you've got these beautiful green fields that are there. And so that goes into that calculus of you early on determining how important it is to protect that water right. And then there's also, in certain areas where that water right is so valuable, I'll work on a 160 acre farm, that's a $10 million conservation easement. And looking through the lens of the limitations we have with the tax credit, is that a good use of the tax credit for me to phase that into 2 $5 million conservation easements to protect that water right? Because that water right is so valuable from a municipal standpoint. And so we could protect maybe 4,000 acres with that amount of money. And so that also goes into it. It's like, all right, is it more important for us to just protect this farm, make sure it doesn't turn into a Walmart? And then, or do we want to make sure that it's fully irrigated in the future because it's highly productive, it's growing vegetables or whatever for the local community? And so those are all factors that you kind of want to start thinking through when you're doing your due diligence on this.
And what you're describing is awareness and appreciation for other community needs for water, whether it's a municipality or whether it's a stream flow. Using Cold Mountain as an example, Cold Mountain Ranch, the Fales place, there had been an extensive stream management planning process along that river to determine that these flows were troublesome late summer, and things lined up perfectly with them to be able to share some water to augment flows. But it also depends sort of on our organizational focus. Are we only working with this landowner, or are we trying to have a broader lens of how it fits in? Key question: does the water support the conservation values? Are the conservation values dependent on the water rights, or do they just support the conservation values? And it's easier if they're dependent. That water has to be tied to the land. If it's supportive of them but not critical, that's maybe a little gray area, where there's plenty of conservation values even without the water, or with just some of the water. And then the more difficult part is the indirect or incidental benefits of water, like seepage from ditches that creates wetlands. And then we do an easement and we say, look, there's all this wetland, it's important habitat, that's part of what we're protecting, but there's no right behind it. So we can't really protect it. And we all have that in our portfolios. That's a tricky thing to navigate.
I think if I may, on that too, looking outside the 4 corners of the property, thinking about where that property is in relation to other ditch systems, if it's at the end of a ditch system, do we want to protect a certain amount of properties along this system so that we know that water is going to be delivered through this system in perpetuity, theoretically? And so it's contextual in a lot of ways, in thinking about what, the seep water or the return flows that farm is providing by irrigating. If that water is taken off of there in the future, then, there are obviously some decreed water court requirements there, but there are some implications there if that water is removed and we don't have it in the conservation easement. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but understanding the context of that particular farm and that water system, both from an ecological standpoint, but then also from a water delivery standpoint.
So have we complicated it enough so far?
Also, feel free to ask questions
please.
during this. we'd like to keep it as much a dialogue and not a monologue.
Yeah, this is definitely not just a checklist to follow. But so if it supports the values, then the next question, we have some decisions to make. Should we encumber the water? Should all of it be encumbered or part of it? Should there be flexibility? Is it enforceable? That is, we don't always guarantee, that's, I mean, there's a natural tension between trying to get these easements done. We're in a race against time. The state's developing. We're losing habitat, losing farmland. We're doing our best to make sure these things are enforceable. But there's no question there's huge challenges awaiting us. Some from our own making and others just completely out of our control. So we'll get into a little more documentation. I'll hand it over to Carmen.
Yeah, so these are all the questions that you generate as you're starting to look at a project. But there are some specific things that we do want to document when we're doing this, and these are kind of the three basics here. One's a water rights memorandum, which can look like a lot of things, but there's two reasons we do this. One is so that we can establish, kind of like a baseline, a specific snapshot of those water rights associated with that property that our stewardship team in the future will be able to reference, and also to give us an understanding of answering those questions on paper. It's also something that's required by a lot of the funders now. GOCO does, and a lot of the others. They want to see that you've gone through an analysis of those water rights and understand where they are in terms of seniority, delivery infrastructure, a whole host of other things that we'll dive into a little bit more. But then the present conditions report or the baseline. Matt, you guys are getting more and more involved in the water rights. We'll show one of Matt's maps up here where we need to understand how that water works across that land. Where are they irrigating? What have they historically irrigated? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then this is kind of a niche thing, but if you're dealing with a mutual ditch company, statutorily we're required to give them 60-day notice before you close on that conservation easement. And so these are things that as you're starting to build up your due diligence and you're doing all the other things, reviewing title and engaging a baseline preparer, getting a mineral remoteness letter, this is running tandem in parallel. And this also will generate questions for you to have with your landowner and then other consultants, other state resources like your local water commissioner, and which can be very regional in terms of how they administer water rights. But that will give you a clear picture of sort of the reliability of those water rights. And then in terms of again, in that memorandum, some of the things that we're looking at are the type of water rights, and it can be multiple different water rights. A lot of times you'll have stock wells, you'll have some direct flow rights, you might have an irrigation well with an augmentation plan, and that's a whole nother can of worms in terms of documenting that. And so you're going to want to pull the decrees or the permits for each of those different water rights and dig into them. And some of these decrees, it's going to be coupled with 20 other water rights. And so you're pouring through a massive document to understand and isolate exactly what you're dealing with that particular owner, and making sure that owner actually owns what they purport to own or what they think they own. And so matching, the title with that. And then really digging into, what amount of water are we talking about in terms of acre feet or CFS, depending upon how it's quantified. That, in my mind, in my landscape, which is in the northeast part of Colorado, where we've got tremendous municipal influence on water systems and demand, and where the Front Range communities, in particular the metropolitan areas, are buying these water rights. And so we need to understand what water sharing potential is out there. So how much water does that farm have that they can potentially lease in the future? Priority appropriation adjudication dates. You guys, if you sat in some of the earlier seminars, you saw a little bit of background on that and how that works. That, again, as we're getting into a drier climate, that informs some of our decisions at COL in terms of if it's a really junior water right, do we want to protect it? We want to make sure that this farm can be irrigated and that we can grow a sustainable crop in the future. The reliability, what kind of ditch infrastructure is in place? Has that been updated? Are we worried about a ditch system that has majority ownership by municipality? And are there going to be issues with delivery in the future if that city decides that, we want to change the bylaws, and then all of a sudden we've got hydrological issues in terms of push water and getting water delivered. We've seen that happen in places like Wheat Ridge. We've got little easements outside of Denver where that ditch doesn't run anymore. And so all of a sudden you've got a water right that can't be delivered and really can impact the conservation values on that property. And so these are things that we're trying to document in that memorandum. And then, what are the other market factors? I've got a lot of farms that, they've got a water right and then they rent a lot of water. We've got a lot of municipalities in the Front Range that own water rights and don't plan to develop them for 20, 30, 40, 50-year horizons. So they lease it back to producers. And so there's a very robust, affordable rent market right now for that. But what does that look like in 30 years when that water's dried up? Thornton right now is drying up 18,000 acres in northern Weld County. And a lot of producers are operating on, short-term leases up there with that water. Well, once that water's gone, then that rent market's gone, and then we're looking at a very different financial situation. And then things like, we'll show you a couple maps in a minute, just to kind of show where that irrigation infrastructure is in place, what fields they've been irrigating, what crop they're growing there, if it's something like a row crop or if they're just cutting hay, what's the historic use there. Again, you're just building that case so that we've got something to look back at in the future. And that also can inform sort of kind of what kind of water sharing opportunities there might be in the future. Like at Cold Mountain Ranch the other day, Bill talked about, okay, we can make decisions based upon, how much hay we put up the year before. So that hay operation looks very different than some of my folks that are growing corn on the Front Range where, they can plug and play with an ATM alternative transfer mechanism or water sharing agreement a little bit differently than somebody that's planting alfalfa every 4 or 5 years. And then we check the abandonment list. We want to make sure folks are familiar with the abandonment list every 10 years. But that water right's not on there. If it is, do we need to take steps to try to remedy that as part of this conservation easement? And Karen's going to talk a little bit more about abandonment list in terms of stewardship in a little bit. And again, getting back to the overall question of why are we protecting what? We're land trusts, most of us, or open space programs. What's conservation values are being supported? And the baseline preparers will address this in their reports as well. We need to document that, particularly when you're spending a lot of money from the tax credit or the IRS's perspective on protecting those water rights. And so then just again, thanks to Matt at Blue Mountain, this is a property that we worked on a couple of years ago, but this is 3 center pivots. Obviously you can see documenting, in this case, we've got a reservoir here so that we have water delivered from the ditch into that reservoir. We know then that they can pump that water to the pivots and then irrigate the fields based upon that. We know that they can get pretty early season water so that their growing season is pretty long, and they've got the infrastructure in place and we understand how this works. Again, it's like a baseline, you want to understand what's going on that property. And then, this is an example of going and pulling the data on what's been historically irrigated. You have to be careful with this because you can see in this photo, the red is the easement area, and we've got, structures here that show as being irrigated. Well, they were historically irrigated. They're not irrigated anymore. And so that triggers a conversation with the landowner and then some adjustments. But again, just documenting and understanding what's been irrigated. Or in some cases, when you pull the decree, there's required dry ups. So there are areas where they're not allowed to irrigate, at least with that particular water right anymore. And again, y'all, this is meant to trigger questions, not to say like this is when you see stuff like this, that's when you start talking to the water commissioner, talking to your landowner, potentially talking to a water rights attorney to understand what you're looking at. And then I talked about mutual ditch company shares, which is a little bit of a niche thing, but essentially mutual ditch companies are organizations that created ditches a long time ago. You buy into stock certificates that you can, as an irrigator, utilize to have water delivered to your particular property. And when we're working with those kind of water rights, we have some specific requirements that we need to do. And part of what we do in our due diligence is calling up the ditch company, understanding a little bit of how they work, reviewing their articles of incorporation or organization, looking at the bylaws. We've run into a couple situations where there were some bylaws that prohibited conservation easements, which was kind of, and so whether or not that's legal or not, I'm not sure. But in those situations, before we could proceed, we needed to either have those bylaws amended or talk to an attorney. So just check that out and make sure there isn't anything in there. Where were those? I think they're in the valley, in the San Luis Valley, if I recall correctly. I'm not sure. What wasn't?
The ditches I've read bylaws on, but
yeah,
I don't know.
I can find out for you. It wasn't in Northeast, but not an uncommon, or not a common thing, but just part of what you're digging up. I mean, this is an investigation in some ways. And then, this is regional in some places, but is there any municipal influence on the ditch? I talked about a ditch taking over, majority ownership in a system, and particularly on the Front Range or in the Arkansas Basin, where we're seeing Aurora go down there and, pay gobs of money for water rights. They're trying to control those systems so that they can move water in the future. If we see that, that's a bit of a red flag for us. Or if we're looking at that system and we see that we've got 10 conservation easements on that system and we're like, we might get to a collective mass where we've protected enough land and water on that system that we know that system's going to be intact in the future. And then post-closing, one of the things that we like to do is have the ditch company reissue a stock certificate with noting our conservation easement. So this is a stock certificate for the Consolidated Home Supply Ditch and Reservoir Company in Larimer and Weld County and counties. And what we'll often do, I don't have it on here, but we'll go to that after the closing. We'll go to them and we'll just have them note that this particular 14 shares is subject to a conservation easement with Colorado Open Lands or whoever the land trust is. The reason we do that is because sometimes these things get transferred without going through the property records or the land records. And so this is another just precaution to note out there that this is subject to a conservation easement and it's encumbered to a particular property. So just a little belt and suspenders there. And then on a different water right in terms of well permits and augmentation plans, that's a whole nother analysis that we look into. You start with the decree. Yeah, please.
On that last slide,
Yeah.
that image, is that a recorded document that will show entitlement, hopefully?
No, yeah. And that's why we want to get our name on it.
How do you find that?
The landowner should have a copy of it. If they don't, then we go to the ditch company and we ask them for it. Yeah, so they're kind of the repository for it. Some ditch companies are really organized, others aren't. Some ditch companies have, 250 farms on them and stock certificate holders. Some have 2. And so it really depends upon the water right.
And would you ever have a landowner that's like, I think I have one of those, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, what's the percentage chance of not finding this, of not knowing?
I mean, all of my landowners, this is gold. And so they protect that very, yeah. But if they don't, check with your ditch company. They should have a copy of that. And then also check to make sure the name's right. I've had situations where it's the wrong name or mom and dad acquired that ditch certificate and then some place in the estate planning, it wasn't transferred and then all of a sudden there's a question there. And so you want to make sure that that matches up with whoever is on the deed of the property. And sometimes they're split into divided shares and get to know your ditch companies. When I first started doing this 8 years ago with some of the mutual ditch companies, they didn't know what a conservation easement was. They thought it was kind of like a taking. They thought it was the government coming in and, taking some of their water. And so, there were a lot of coffee conversations and just saying, look, guys, we're just trying to keep this water in your system. I think, we're aligned in a lot of ways. And so there's some relationship building there that I think goes a long way, particularly when you have a landowner that's interested in. And another interesting thing on ditch companies, and I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but a couple of years ago, when the tax credit was increased, we also increased who qualified for the tax credit. So mutual ditch companies, water conservation districts, and water conservancy districts now qualify. So we're starting to work with some of them on protecting land that they own or on concepts where they don't want to see farmland dried up on their system. So they'll buy a farm if a landowner is retiring, do the conservation easement, and then make it available to someone else on that system at an easement encumbered value. And so there's some interesting things going on in the ditch company world. And so get to know your irrigation companies. And then just really quickly on well permits, these are completely different. They're administered so differently depending upon the division. Sally deals with a very interesting situation down in the San Luis Valley where they're coming up against some pumping issues. The Republican River the same way, where they might be turning off wells in the future. In the South Platte, fortunately for us, most of our wells have augmentation plans, which means people are able to pump groundwater because they are replenishing surface water, either through an augmentation pond or a pump or something like that. And that's a whole nother discussion. But you need to understand how they're able to pump that water, how much they're able to pump, and then how they're supplementing that with augmentation if that's a requirement in your particular area. If you're doing a conservation easement in the Republican River Basin right now, which I don't know if folks know where that is, it's basically Nebraska and Kansas. It's another river in Colorado. They're worried. If I was going to do an easement out there, I don't know if that well is going to be shut off in the future. So I've got a question because of compact requirements. And so that's a red flag right there if we're looking at an easement there. That's a whole nother session, so I'm not going to dive into that. But if you do have well permits, check them out. Also, if it's a domestic permit and they're watering stock with it, ask some questions about that because well permits have, it's like a right-of-way or an easement. They have limitations. And so you need to check out that permit and understand that. Are we okay on time? Okay. Lastly, one of the things that, as I'm doing this due diligence, we talked about what you're protecting within the four corners of that property with regard to the conservation values. I'm also thinking about water rights as an economic building block for that community and for that landowner. And so we used to, in the land trust community, encumber those water rights and say you have to use them how you've historically used them on that property. You can't take it to another farm you have. You can't leave it in the river like Bill's doing at his place at Cold Mountain, or you can't share it with your local town that's trying to grow. We've started building in the flexibility so that you can, and that might look like 3 out of 10 years, that might look like deficit irrigating in certain years. We started building in that flexibility with an eye that these systems, they're obviously not within the four corners of the property. They're part of larger systems. And as we face other threats in that system, like for instance, a water being swept by a ditch company, are there opportunities where that protected water right can be utilized to help the overall system? In Northeast, we're looking at opportunities to share with municipalities. Historically, buy and dry, where a municipality or a water provider buys a farm, strips those water rights off, is how they've been accessing water in the Front Range. We don't want them to do that. We want to create opportunities for them to lease water. Let's say it's a dry year and their reservoir levels drop. They only need that water so often. They don't need it every year to turn on faucets. And so there are opportunities, if you have enough protected lands in those landscapes, for them to actually pay that landowner a premium to refill those reservoirs. And you've got to be careful about this. And so when you're doing your water rights analysis, you need to understand if they pull some of that water off in the future, is that going to impact the conservation values? And so that's part of our water rights due diligence analysis. And that's something that we're trying to think a little forward in terms of also making those private lands viable for producers in the future. In my neck of the woods, a lot of folks have gotten by with oil and gas royalties when farming or commodities prices have gone down. It's not getting any easier to farm or to ranch. And so if there are opportunities for them to diversify their income stream in the future and not negatively impact the conservation values, we're open to those water sharing opportunities with municipalities or for in-stream flow opportunities or recreational or other things like that. And so we're always looking at the eye to build in that flexibility when we're going through this. And then just lastly, in terms of that flexibility, another thing that I'll document is this system. So these are two different ditch systems north of Greeley, Larimer Weld and New Cache. And you can see they're massive ditch systems, irrigate a lot of ground. I'll isolate and figure out, all right, well, we're going to protect this farm. Are there markets nearby where they might be able to either share that water, lease it to another producer on that system, or maybe that it's Greeley or Evans or one of these other folks that are on that system. And then where are they on the system? Are they at the very end? Are they going to have issues getting water delivered to them? Is that a good investment for our conservation dollars to protect a farm at the end of the system? Just questions to think about. And those are questions that you dialogue with your local water commissioner, the ditch company, even the municipalities. In this case, we talk to Greeley probably once a month and we're like, all right, guys, you don't want to cannibalize all this farmland around you. How do you want to access your water in the future? Are there opportunities for us to partner? We're working on protecting this along the ditch system. What's important to you all? And so just, I guess, as a lesson, think about the broader context of those water rights. And then, I'll turn it back to Ben.
Awesome. So we're going to look at some tools and do a little case study. I tried to find a simple water right that there was data on. All these tools are imperfect. So there's some public databases through the Division of Water Resources. We have a subscription to a tool called B3, which is a compiling database. It pulls county data, state data, but there's big problems with these databases. They're very inconsistent. So our case study, we're going to look at this is the Golden Nuggets River Ranch. Kelsey managed this project, closed last year. This is along the Tarryall Creek in Eastern Park County. And so you can see this is, an irrigated field. The ditch obviously comes out of this. It's Hay Creek over coming through that gap in the canyon. Just irrigates this little pasture. Seems really straightforward. Most of the time, it's not so simple. But so we'll illustrate, and this might be the clunkiest part of this presentation is going through these databases, but I'll try to just show what they are. And so I'm going to, switch over here. So one tool we use to start with is B3. This is a fairly expensive tool. We have a subscription to it. This is, again, the compiling data set, but it's very handy, especially when you're starting out or you're taking a call from a landowner and trying to figure out what's the context, where are you, an initial sort of scoping phase. And so I'll just illustrate how this is handy. We also have added layers to it. So I'm going to zoom into Park County, and we've put on these are just existing easements. The pinkish being from COMAP, and then the yellow being Colorado Open Lands Easements, our own data set. This also, you can put the public lands and other things in there. So over here on the Tarryall, let's see, where are we? So from a scoping perspective, I'm going to turn these things off. So, say we get a call from this landowner and they say, okay, we're over here. Well, this tool is really handy because it has the parcel data from the counties. So we can go and say these folks' name is Gold. So we can just search for first the land. Where are they? And this is working, I believe, slowly. I'll just zoom into where it is. All right, we've got a pretty slow system here. This might not.
And just while he's doing that, a note on this. Yeah, B3 is expensive. Not every, several $1,000s, I think, a year. Yeah. Not every shop's going to be able to do that. We are talking to Keep It Colorado to think about, is there a repository there for all of us to utilize that subscription? Who knows if that goes anywhere, but it's also something where, you can get on the phone and call like one of us and say, hey, like I want to just like do a quick little search on this, and we might be able to help you guys with that. Like it's we're all trying to collaborate and share these resources, and we all have finite budgets. And so there are opportunities for that, and we want to be able to utilize these tools in efficient ways to make our work better. But of course, it's not.
Yeah, so, it requires an internet connection and some RAM space in your computer. What I was about to show you, though, is you go in, you can find a property really quickly and easily if there's county assessor GIS data that it's pulling from. And then there's going to be a lag. The county might update their stuff. B3 might come 6 months later and update theirs. But I think I saved some. Did I save maps of this? Well, I'll jump to this report. So you find the property, and then you tab down, and you will search for water rights. And it'll populate with data from the Division of Water Resources. And it'll show you in some areas where the diversion point is. Sometimes it'll draw a nice polygon for the irrigated area. It'll show you well permits. And then you can click on these things and get to other data. Other places, it doesn't show the irrigated area, or it doesn't show the diversion points in the right location, etc. But sort of the first step is it'll produce this little report of a water right. Really great starting point. So this is where we are going with this. So we've got this publicly available data here from Water Resources. It brings it in, shows the irrigated area, shows the head gate, and then it gets into more details about the water right. It tells you decreed amounts. Moving down, the list links to the water rights, which we'll follow these links in a second. So this is 2 water rights off the same ditch to to appropriation dates, administered separately. You get into net amounts, and then they actually put the diversion records in here as well. So really quick, easy way to get a snapshot of what's going on with the water right. And that's very, very handy. Then you need to dig further. And so again, sort of sequence-wise, you're asking the landowner, what are your water rights? And I'll say X, Y, Z. You can go in here and try to find them. But then we need to find the decree. There's several steps of verifying water right. We need to know if they own it. This data does not track ownership. The state doesn't track water rights ownership. So you might find that in your title work. You might not find it in your title work. It might be just an appurtenance to the property, and that can be good enough. If people agree, as we talk about, talking with the water commissioner is really helpful, but you should ask your landowner first. In some geographies, landowner might have a ditch where it's out of compliance. The flume is blown out, and they might not want the state to know that right away, so we don't want to incriminate our clients. At the same time, it needs to be in compliance to be protected, so this is one of those points of ambiguity. So if this link works today, what's clever about this tool is you can click on this and it'll take you right to the state's website where they list their decrees. In an ideal world, it would just show you the decree that's here. Instead, this first one is not easy to read, and it's 49 pages long. That might or might not be the water right. The next one down isn't even in the same basin. This is in Montrose County. So
if it's in cursive, it's probably pretty senior. So
yeah.
That's usually a good sign.
It's stretching, Chris, to your question? Okay. Yeah, Matt.
Ben, 2 or 3 frames back, was that output a B3 output?
Yes. Yeah, it is. This detail report is, you just click the summary report on this water right, and it gives you this great starting point.
And that's the $7,000 a year?
I don't know how much
Something like that. But we use it a lot. Daily.
Which makes sense for us. We're a 27-person
Yeah,
organization.
and both stewardship and conservation use it. But it's more or less useful depending on where you are in the state. So, this is not the decree. So, this is just a time-consuming process. You have to go through all of these documents and find the one that has your decree. In this particular case, this is one of these 200-page decrees. So you have to sort through it and find your water right, and I won't belabor that. I already did it, or maybe Kelsey did. So within this long document, you look through and oh, there it is, priority number 69. Maybe you already knew it was number 69, so you could jump there. Sometimes these big decrees will have water rights organized in different ways. In the Wet Mountain Valley in the late 1890s, they sort of re-adjudicated everything under this big decree. And they list the priorities by tributary, by sub-basin, and then down in the Arkansas, and so it has different priority numbers, and it's helpful to know all of those. But what you're looking for here is the appropriation date, the decree itself, what the decree says it's used for, where it's allowed to be used, and that basic information. One of the things we've started making sure, so I just took this long document, or Kelsey did, and copied out these pages. And so it describes, this is the original decree, and this might or might not match the title work and the deeds. And that's another decision point. Which do you rely on? The decree is sort of the determining factor. And so it's supposed to be the most important part of this. So, for hang season, you can see this stuff. It describes how long the ditch is, gives the priority sequence. This is the second right, the extension on this, another 3 CFS off this stream, and fairly senior situation in that part of Park County. So we got the decree. That only took a day and a half. And I'm joking, it shouldn't take that long, but it might. We can't rely on B3 alone. So we still have to go back to the state databases, as well as mentioned already, talking to the landowner, looking at the land, looking at title work. So the state database decision support system, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and there's different utilities in this system as well. And I think in practice, we use both of these. We cross-check. There's also, in recent years, their mapping system has gotten a lot better. This is all Division of Water Resources website. So they have a similar mapping online GIS that shows water rights. It should be the same as what you're seeing in B3, but there's actually additional information. For example, they have, as Carmen was mentioning, they have dry up information. If it's irrigated dry up, well, that's only maybe the last less than 10 years of data. So another property that we were thinking about showing today that's a little more complicated, has like 5 water rights on it. This data set only shows 3 of them. It has 2 little dry ups, it only shows 1 of them. So again, an imperfect situation. But this really, my main advice is to spend time with it, play with it, poke around, going back over to where we were in Park County under the same system. And so this is free to the public, free to everyone. We can get in here, and it's approximately in here, just start looking for structures. So these are diversion points and structures, and here they are. And so we happen to be looking at this one. Whoops, if I can get it. Yeah, Hay Creek Ditch. So this is showing the same information. It doesn't have the parcel data. So you've got to look at the topography or know where you are in all this. But then it also has links where you can find additional information. And this has really gotten very handy these days. So it has a lot of the same information we were just seeing in B3, where you've got the ditch, you've got what it's used for, all these things. And then importantly, it's got a link to additional information. One of the key things to note also within the Division of Water Resources is that, especially if there's been any changes to this water right since it was decreed, which is very common, there'll be a whole bunch of documentation. There'll be referees' rulings, there'll be applications for changes, there'll be site visit documentation, and those are a wealth of information and worth reading. And when there is that much information, usually it's typed and very easy to read as well, so that's an advantage. However, this isn't linked directly to those decrees. So you have to go over and go to the water rights section and then find the decrees. And this one's, as I said, this is a simple one, so you can find the case numbers, view these documents. One of the ways we've started putting in our deed when we have an exhibit listing water rights is what they call the WDID. It's the number that the state uses to track water rights, and it's a shortcut for looking them up in the future. So we want to have that exhibit, the decreed date, the appropriated date, the adjudication date, the use, the source, the amount, and the WDID. So that is a handy reference. But, just opening this up again here, this one is 197 pages. It's the same document, so you have the same exercise to go through. So in this case, it actually organized it for you, and it popped right up. So that's the basic search. Are there components of that I'm forgetting right now? I'm sorry we can't show you B3 very well. We're real sorry. Not working. So sometimes there'll be spatial data associated with it, sometimes not. One of the advantages of B3 also is that you can download. So there'll be this spatial data, and you can download a shapefile, put it right in your GIS or put it right in Google Earth or whatever system you're using. Not necessarily perfect, but a great starting point. When Matt goes out in the baseline, this polygon might not look directly right on the land, and so there's probably a better description of that irrigated area a lot of the time, but it's pretty darn close. It's a good starting point. Any questions about all of that? That was sort of an abbreviated walkthrough. It just layers complexity when you have multiple rights, or if you're clicking on B3 and you see all these points of diversion, you have to sort through which ones did the landowner claim to have Are we sure these ones also serve the property? Or maybe here's a head gate on the property, but a water right owned downstream, it's not there, so there's a right of way. We need to know about that. And like Carmen was saying, the context. This is as simple as a water right gets. It's just a creek and a diversion, and that's it. There's nobody else involved. So that doesn't happen very often.
Just one other note, this, we talked about why we're doing all this. This will also help your appraiser. So as they're trying to put a valuation on that particular water right and understanding how much they irrigate, what fields are being irrigated, because they're also doing an analysis on, particularly in my landscape, a price point on the dry land versus the irrigated land, et cetera. And so having an understanding of that you can help facilitate with them, that'll go a long way too. So.
On that note, part of this research can also help answer the question, should the water rights have some separate valuation analysis or not? And, a little right like this one on a little tributary far from the main stem, it's transferable. In this case, we asked that of the water commissioner. Is it at risk? Could it be severed? Right now, there's no market for it, but maybe someday. But that's a very different question if you have CBT water.
Or mutual
or
ditch
something,
company
or-
water right, that the stock certificate shares can be transferred outside of the property depending upon the bylaws. So yeah, it's almost like a separate property right, a separate estate or bundle of the sticks. So.
Yeah, so we'll hand it over to Karen now on what happens after we encumbered this water with some degree of certainty and some degree of documentation as
we
to
just- We're
its
done with it. It's their problem.
Do you have a written procedure?
Yeah,
Would you be willing to share that?
we would. Yeah.
Absolutely. And ours is partly based on, originally the Colorado Water Trust created this, pretty robust. Ours, we've taken a step further. And it's, it's an art as much as anything.
But we do. So we have a checklist, and then I can also provide you with an example of a water rights memo that we generate, and sort of it's at least a template that you can work from. And so, if you guys want to grab a card, we'd be happy to email that to you. Yeah, it's not proprietary or anything.
Yeah. And then GOCO has something similar.
Yeah.
If you worked with them lately, they require looking at a water rights memo. Yeah. And this memo also is intended to be helpful for the baseline, for the appraisal, for ourselves. It's sort of a supplement to all the rest of the due diligence. It doesn't necessarily get incorporated into any of those documents. It might, but it's another sort of piece of the puzzle.
Good morning, everyone. So I work on our stewardship team. I work out of our West Cliff office. I'm one of our 3 land and water stewards that we have on our stewardship team. So I'm going to go through what water rights stewardship looks like once the water is encumbered. So first thing I'll start with is that any water rights that the conservation team decides belong to be into the conservation easement and are encumbered, we assume that they at least support the conservation values. They may be essential to the conservation values as well. But if they're encumbered, we assume that in some way they do support those conservation values that the easement is protecting. So therefore, our main risk of violation to the easement is loss of water on the land. I do want to acknowledge that there's quite a bit of intermediate risks that we face too, of maybe inconsistent use over time or less than full use of the water rights that are encumbered. But our main risk of a violation is that loss of water on the land. And this primarily happens through either abandonment of those rights or the sale of those rights separate from the property. So, abandonment, how does this happen? I have a quote on here that is directly from the Division of Water Resources website. And abandonment essentially is that your water rights have not been used adequately enough in the last decade. So it comes out every 10 years, came out in 2000, 2010, 2020. Next one will be in 2030. They can be subject to abandonment. And abandonment happens as a result of the intent of the owner to discontinue permanently the use of all or part of the water available. So it really does have to do with that intent. And if the landowner does not show that a water right has been put to beneficial use, when water is available for a period of 10 years or more, then they make an assumption that that water right has been abandoned. And when they declare that assumption, it comes out on that first draft of the abandonment list, then it falls to the landowner to prove that they did not intend to abandon that water right. And the reason I get into intent is that a lot of landowners can be successful in arguing their right off of that list by showing that they purchase infrastructure or they have some sort of issue and they're working with their commissioner to try to get things back into compliance, or maybe their water right was so junior that they weren't able to use it, and they can show that with structure call analysis evidence. So really it has to all do with that intent, and that is how you keep things on or off the list. So the reason that the Division of Water Resources will do this is because a lot of these basins are over appropriated. They want to make sure that water rights that aren't being used anymore are off their list and cannot be used anymore if they have been abandoned. And they make these assumptions based on what they're seeing in their system. So if there's a lack of diversion records, say the landowner just doesn't submit them, or there's records that show less than, consistent less than full use, they could be ending up on the list, although I don't know any of them that have at least shown that they've used their water rights, some that have ended up on the list. But this can also happen because a landowner may choose they don't want to use their rights anymore. This can be due to relationships. So I do have an example of a landowner who has been meaning to install all of their infrastructure for a right for some number of years now, and they ended up on the abandonment list. They were able to argue themselves off of it because they were able to show receipts that they, purchased all this infrastructure. It just needs to be installed for them to be able to use it. But their neighbor is like, if you try to put this stuff on because the point of diversion is on their neighbor's property, I will call the sheriff. And so even though he has every right to do that, and the sheriff would, probably accompany him and let him do that and try to talk with his neighbor, he's just worried about ruining that relationship with his neighbor forever if he does that. So he's been trying to navigate that relationship. A landowner may be a successive landowner, or perhaps they're retiring or whatnot, and they decide to have a land use change. Maybe they were in production and they're like, I can't afford to do this anymore. Or they sell to a property owner that, doesn't want to grow hay, that sort of thing. There are also significant costs with operating your water right. There's all sorts of infrastructure costs, labor costs, time costs. In the area I work in, the Wet Mountain Valley, labor is a consistent issue. A lot of landowners that are having any problems with their water rights, they often have to do it themselves if they need to fix an issue. So our challenges with abandonment is that we want to be able to support these landowners in trying to keep their rights off their lists. And often landowners go, well, don't you have any documentation to show that I've been using them? And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And a lot of that documentation is through our monitoring reports and photos. But we want to recognize that monitoring reports and photos are a snapshot in time. We're not going out there multiple days a year for most of our properties, especially with a big portfolio like ourselves. So that can be challenging. If we're not out there when it's irrigating, then we don't really have anything to help them. Diversion records are also kind of contentious because they need a timely submission. Technically landowners are supposed to be submitting their diversion records every month, but I know that a lot of them don't do that until maybe the end of the year, or maybe they don't do it at all, or after a couple of years, that sort of thing. And there's caveats with those diversion records, even if they submit them. So if you've all ever looked at diversion records before, they often only show the total amount that was diverted per month. And there's no explanation of why that number is the way it is. If it's a 0, why is it a 0? Was it because you had some sort of issue with your infrastructure? Was it because there was a call on the river? That sort of thing. And a lot of the diversion records also don't show the actual irrigated area. So a decree might explain, you irrigate with this water right 20 acres in this part of the property. But that may not be what it actually looks like on the ground. And when you're submitting those diversion records, you're not necessarily submitting that geographical data with it. Our challenges with structures, if we wanted to be able to say, okay, you know, we want to get pictures of your structures in use so that we can have that evidence for you, you can also see that structures don't always exist on the property that they're being used on. So in that case, we then have to get permission from neighbors. We'd hope that the landowner will help us coordinate those types of visits if that's something that we wanted to do. But it just adds more logistical challenges and time costs to our workload. As I mentioned, irrigation may not be happening during monitoring, and sometimes even if it is, it's hard to show that. I will show a picture later on a different slide that kind of illustrates this, that you know, you can look out on a hayfield and I was up to my hips in water, and but when I just am taking a picture of that, it just looks like a nice lush green field, and we're not actually seeing that water on the landscape since it's obscured by all the vegetation. Finally, I wanted to mention that structures may be aging, where they may not be used properly or be unable to be used. So there's a property in my portfolio that they had a couple of major flood events that really channelized their stream. So now the water doesn't even make it up to their ditch. And so they've been undergoing a restoration project to try to bring that stream level up high enough to get into the ditch. But these are all issues that landowners are facing. And like Ben said, we don't want to incriminate our landowners by collecting evidence of improper use that could get them fines or something else also. We also faced a lot of challenges in documentation. So I'm sure many of you that have old easements are very familiar with this. There's inconsistent or unclear language. Sometimes they don't even describe what water rights are encumbered, or potentially those properties didn't have any water rights that were encumbered at the time, but the easement implies that any water rights they obtain, even just a domestic well, would be encumbered. And so that unclear language makes it hard for us to determine what we need to be monitoring sometimes. And if there's an issue such as they need to prove that they have been making progress and they don't intend to abandon their water right, they have to have that supporting documentation, and landowners often don't share that supporting documentation with us, such as receipts and that sort of thing. And so if they lose their copies, there's nothing we can really do to help them. So sometimes we've been asking landowners to send us all your information. We'll keep a backup for you, just so that that information is available if they ever need it. And so when we get to enforcement, say abandonment happened, and we need to try to help get those rights off the abandonment list, we have to really think to ourselves, when is this worth it? If a right gets fully abandoned and we were to try to reunite it with the property, that can be extremely costly for both the landowner and ourselves. And as Ben has mentioned, and Carmen as well, water administration is not uniform across the state. So right now, I primarily work out of Division 2 area, and they're phasing out feudal calls, for example, and they've been trying to breach ponds that don't have a decree. So we're not necessarily going to fight the state on those types of decisions. And I'll share another example. We had a property that a right was put on the abandonment list, and we decided not to fight it because the water commissioner explained to us that he couldn't find the point of diversion. He saw no historical evidence of irrigation, potentially as far back as even before the easement encumbered the water rights. And so in that case, we're like, well, this water right was potentially not ever used even when the easement was done, and so is it really going to impact those conservation values? Those are the type of questions we have to ask when we're facing that. So our other big stewardship challenge is when a sale happens of water rights separately from the property, when they're encumbered. And this really puts us into a reactive instead of a proactive type of stance for enforcement, because we often don't find out about these types of issues until after they've already happened. So as Ben has mentioned, there is the state does not track ownership. The only way that you can really be 100% certain that your landowner owns their water right is to find their deed for that water right. And that's something that your county clerks and recorders will have recorded in their databases. But as you may also know, a lot of recorders don't put that information online where you can search it for free. you sometimes have to get an iCounty subscription or actually go to that physical place and look through their records. There's also with leases, if your easements allow for water rights to be leased to other entities, landowners may not tell us when they have done that. It can be tricky for us to tell when irrigation is happening if it's a particularly wet year. As an example, in my location, we've had really bad years where it's really obvious when irrigation is happening and where it's not. But other years, there's just so much natural precipitation or the sub-irrigation from the aquifer underneath that they may not had to have irrigated, and it still looks like it has been. So it's hard for us to tell when a water has been removed from the landscape for a particular monitoring season. There are tools that you can use, and I won't go over these again because Ben just demonstrated those for us. But this is also where we tend to turn to first. DWR website, if we're having some sort of issue, we got to dig into their details through the diversion records. B3 Insight can be nice because a lot of them show the ownership because they are checking with that county data, but not always. And sometimes it's not accurate or updated. So when we get to enforcement, again, it makes us reactive, not proactive, which is not where we want to be. And it can be costly if we want to try to reunite those water rights. We at COL have not particularly run into the sale of a water right separately from property that we've tried to then, reunite. But we have known of other land trusts that have. And I'm forgetting exactly the name of the land trust this was, but they were fighting a case. And I also don't remember if they were successful or not, but they spent $500,000 in court just trying to get this resolved. So that's not a place we want to be.
I think that was
Was it? Yeah. Were you guys successful?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the case you're referring to, but this was years ago.
Yeah.
Set precedents, we won.
Awesome.
I put in a plug for having a relationship with your water administrators because we were flagged by the water company.
Awesome. Well, congrats. At least the money was worth it. Awesome. So let's get into how we want to improve our stewardship. Our goal is always to be proactive, not reactive as much as possible. And so with monitoring, we're now starting, especially with the satellite monitoring that's becoming available to us. We're doing a combination of on-the-ground and satellite methods. It can be actually really nice for us to, if we're out there and we're like, it doesn't look like they're irrigating, I wasn't able to talk to the landowner, or they're being vague or something like that, we can then go and look at the satellite imagery to really get that big picture and see if there seems to be evidence of water on the landscape. Because as much as in this arid landscape, it's pretty obvious when it's irrigated. As in the example picture here, it's nice and green on an otherwise brown landscape. We also try to get photos of active irrigation, so if we see that there's infrastructure out there that has water coming out of it, we get pictures of that and geolocate them. We also try to collect testimonials from landowners for why a water right's not being used. So if they're, we're out there and they're like, yeah, I'm having trouble this year irrigating, or I haven't started yet, we can be like, well, why? And then we have that information that they can maybe use as evidence later. For example, I had a landowner the other day who lives near a burn scar, and his irrigation last year, all of his infrastructure got plugged up with sand, and so he wasn't able to irrigate as much as he wanted to. He finally got it fixed later in the season and used some water, but all those months in the beginning of the year are going to show zeros, and he needs to have an explanation for that. Other tools we're using is GIS, and so we use Upstream Tech in their Lenth platform for our satellite monitoring, and they have tools built in there, especially the vegetation analyses, where you can compare year to year. Sometimes they can even run analyses for all time, so you can kind of see the trend. What are our peaks for vegetation throughout the year? And if we were to see a particularly low year, that would indicate to us that they weren't irrigating that year. We can also do more large-scale environmental data analyses where you can, there's tons of information out there online for free that you can download for environmental data. And you can do like a 30-year analysis to see are we seeing a general trend, and does our irrigation patterns fit that general trend, or is it more because they're stopping irrigation and not using their water right? Awesome. This is the photo that I wanted to highlight also. This was the field that I was in up to hip deep water while I was walking around in there. So yeah, it's just a wonderfully lush green field. To me, it's obvious that they're irrigating, but it might not be to everybody looking at that photo. But one thing that we want to always try to do with landowners that are facing any issues with their water right is to get them assistance. So there's lots of different resources out there to get them technical assistance, like how do I even try to raise my creek up to get water in the ditch again. There's also a lot of financial barriers and groups that can help overcome those. And there's also certain programs like crop programs and other things through NRCS, as an example, that we could try to get a landowner enrolled in. And that also gives them extra evidence to say, hey, I'm working on this and I'm trying to fix my problems so that I can use my water right and actually be able to provide that evidence against an abandonment. We're also trying to improve our data tracking. So right now we have all of our different information and all our different deeds and baselines and that sort of thing. We're working on kind of an internal spreadsheet just to see what kind of data we want to track. And then we also use Salesforce's locate program to do a lot of our monitoring, reporting, and other data tracking on a cloud service. And we're trying to also think about how we might use that program and incorporate water rights tracking into that as well. But, you know, as we're working through that process, we're like, what details are necessary to actually include in our databases and our data tracking? We don't want to just clog up the system with a bunch of information that's not going to be helpful for us. So that's something we're still working through. And then finally, I wanted to put a plug in. A lot of the divisions throughout the overarching Division of Water Resources, all 7 divisions have monthly resumes that go out, and you can sign up for those. And they basically just tell you, like, here's the cases that are, or applications that are coming through water court. And that has actually helped us be able to say, oh, we know that one is, you know, owned by one of our landowners. What are they doing with their right? So we have actually been able to catch some of those before they go through to a final decision by looking at those monthly resumes. So I just want to end on, what are you trying? We want to hear from you because we know that we're all learning together. And, you know, as easements get older and we're getting more complex into our system, we want to all be working together towards the same goals and know what's working and what's not working for all of you as well. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to any questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in terms of enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
I have a case right now with an absolute stinker of a landowner who has basically abandoned his field and is likely using his water shares somewhere else, which he's not supposed to do.
Right.
It's not at risk for abandonment. It's a mutual ditch company situation. We're having a hard time figuring out how to enforce it.
Yeah.
I talked to him about it. He, oh, we're fouling the field. It looks horrible.
Yeah.
It's obvious. It's just been neglected.
Yeah.
But when it comes to enforcement, forcing someone to farm is a real challenge.
Right.
I'm curious if you have any insight.
Yeah. We haven't faced anything quite like that yet. I'm sure we will. I would first ask, have you talked to the water commissioner at all?
We have talked to the water company.
Okay. Just
The
be,
water company or the water commissioner?
yeah.
Oh, good question. No, I haven't talked to the water.
Yeah, I would maybe suggest reaching out to them because they're really not supposed to do that without a change case. So they might be able to give you some strategies on how you might approach them or, you know, be willing to approach them together, that sort of thing. That can also be kind of contentious. I know a lot of landowners are not happy with their water commissioners, depending on where you are and what kind of challenges they're facing. But, I mean, if you're already kind of in conflict with your landowner, that would be my first suggestion. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what your risk is. I mean, if you think it's really affecting those conservation values, then I'd say you have every right to try to get it remedied, and that would be the first step I would recommend.
And if I could just add to that.
Yeah,
You
please.
know, as an easement holder, you have an interest in that property. There are the politics of that, and then there's what you actually have the right to. And so We do want to check with our landowners before we call water commissioners, but if you're having an issue there, you have every right to call that water commissioner as well, because you have an interest in that property interest.
Absolutely. And we want to try to maintain those positive landowner relationships, but I'd say yeah, if he's already being uncooperative, then yeah, then you start going to the other people that can help you out.
The question for you is that, was that original landowner, or is the one who has the easement now, are they the one who put it on the property, or did it get sold to them?
He's the landowner's son who passed away.
Yeah, and I will say we have landowners that are constantly like, I'm worried my kids aren't going to do this and I'm going to have issues. And yeah, it's challenging for sure.
The successional landowner thing is a whole nother animal, as y'all know.
Absolutely.
So, folks that put easements on properties have a certain intent and vision, and then that's where we really start hitting issues, generally speaking.
Yeah, and I totally understand we don't want to force people to farm, but if there's if they don't have problems with their infrastructure, they can still irrigate and not have a crop, So that's kind of my take on it, to be honest. So.
You mentioned that resources that you direct landowners to who need like financial or technical assistance. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so a lot of the time I point people to NRCS. They have tons of experience. Especially in our valley, they do everything from, irrigation type of work to, fencing projects, all sorts of different things that are water related. So that's who I point them to a lot. I also point them to CSU Extension because they've just got so much information, and they've got professionals that can help people like kind of think through the steps that it would take. But there's also different organizations out there that can help that are primarily restoration based. So for example, in my area, we have a group out of Canyon City called River Science, and they've been helping with that restoration project for the landowners facing the channelization problem. So just trying to, put in BDAs and other channel spanning structures to help get that sediment and stream bed raised up again. So it takes a little bit of research to see what's available in your area, but definitely NRCS and CSU can recommend. So.
Yeah, our NRCS office is very understaffed, so
Yeah, us too.
There can be other funding sources. For example, in Chaffee County, we have an open space type tax. And one of the things we've been funding is irrigation improvements, infrastructure improvements for the same kind of situations. And very
And
popular
sometimes
program.
the water commissioners themselves, like again on that one that needs restoration, the water commissioner came out to my landowners, was like, you guys are on the abandonment list. And they're like, oh shoot. And so he was, like, I can help you get organized and get stuff figured out. I will say that some water commissioners are more familiar with conservation easements than others. But if you can explain to them, like, look, we really need to keep this water right because it's encumbered so that they're not facing a violation of the easement as well, they can be a good place to turn to as well.
And that's an example of a really helpful long-term water commissioner who actually is a rancher himself, has done conservation easements, really gets it. But that is far from uniform. And many parts of the state, the commissioners are being tasked with curtailing every possible water right when there's an opportunity. And so the lens is different. He's trying to keep water on the land, but a lot of his colleagues are being directed to find the holes, find the problems, put things on the abandonment list, or curtail ponds, and so forth. So they can be a resource if you're lucky.
Yes.
So one of the things you encounter too is turnover in the water commissioner ranks. In our area, which is Commissioner Area 38, I've had 11 commissioners in the last decade. Wow. So it's hard to develop those long-term relationships required to have a good understanding both of what they expect and what you expect. And so it's just a continual education process. You have to be diligent about it because if you aren't, things deteriorate pretty quickly. So.
And there's also turnover in the division engineers, but if you're facing a situation like that, you might also want to get the division engineer familiar with you. But yeah, they tend not to be on the ground as much, so they'll be more limited than a commissioner. Any other questions? Are people collecting like diversion records? Are they going out to see structures? I mean, I know it's a big burden on all of us, so our team hasn't really been doing that unless it's convenient and part of the property. Or if landowner's proactive and sends us that information. We have a couple of them, but generally not our typical thing.
I think it's one thing that's overlooked, at least I think our organization has overlooked that to some degree, about gathering that information from the landowners or explaining to possible conservation holders, easement holders, how important it is that they provide that information to the Division of Water Resources.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I've started to make it now part of my, instead of just being like, how's water this year? Being like, did you submit your diversion records? Do you know how to do that? Do you know where to look for structure call analysis to see if you can even use your water? These are all things that landowners might not even know how to do, that we can help with. So,
Particularly the successional ones.
yes. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. I'll just put up our thank you slide. This is our contact information. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks for listening.